The HOA president stormed onto my property the day I moved in, demanding I surrender my waterfront land. She claimed a community agreement with the dead previous owner and threatened to ruin my life. What she didn't know, this wasn't just a cabin. It was a trap set for greedy bullies like her. And I held the trigger. But let me rewind. How did a dream move-in day become a war zone? I just sat down with my coffee, soaking in the lake silence for the first time in 18 years, when her heels cracked the gravel like gunshots. I looked up to see a woman impeccably dressed in a suit that had no place in these woods, moving with an unnerving certainty. Each step was purposeful, as if she were already claiming this land as her own. The breeze caught her hair, but she didn't seem to notice, too absorbed in her march toward me, her eyes cold and calculating. She had that entitled stride that screams, "I'm about to ruin your day." And honestly, I should have locked my door right then. Her outfit was perfectly coordinated suburban armor, complete with a clipboard and what appeared to be official-looking documents, like she'd dressed specifically to intimidate homeowners. She didn't knock, didn't introduce herself, just started scanning my property with this calculating look that made my skin crawl. Her eyes moved methodically from my dock to my shoreline to my cabin, like she was conducting some kind of property appraisal without permission. When she finally spoke, her voice had this tone that suggested whatever she was about to say wasn't up for discussion. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be impressed or intimidated, but honestly, I was mostly just confused. "I'm Laura Kent, the president of the Homeowners Association here at Willow Lake. We're in charge of maintaining the aesthetic harmony of the area." Her smile was tight, like she was offering a favor no one had asked for, and her eyes flicked over my cabin with thinly veiled judgment. "You must be new here. We have a certain standard of living we like to uphold." The way she said standards made it sound like I was already failing some test I didn't know I was taking. Laura pulled out this hand-drawn map that looked like something a kid might sketch for a school project, complete with wobbly lines and what appeared to be crayon marks. She pointed directly at my beautiful waterfront area with the confidence of someone presenting evidence in a murder trial. The way she was studying my dock and shoreline made me feel like I was watching someone case a house for a robbery. "This part has always been community property," she said, tapping the paper with her finger like she was marking territory. "The previous owner understood that. There's been an arrangement in place for years." I'm not even sure why I stayed calm at that point, because inside I was thinking, seriously? Did she really just walk onto my property and tell me I don't own part of it? But I kept my voice level and asked to see the paperwork for this supposed arrangement. That's when I pulled out my official property deed and survey map, both stamped with those red official seals that actually mean something legally. I spread them out on my deck table like a poker player laying down a royal flush, pointing to the clearly marked boundaries that showed I owned everything to the waterline. "According to these legal documents, I own everything to the waterline," I told her, trying to keep things factual and reasonable. But Laura barely glanced at my paperwork before waving it away like it was completely irrelevant. She kept insisting on some verbal agreement with Walker, the previous owner, but something was off about the way she said his name. Her voice shifted, became defensive, and her gaze flickered away for just a second. "Walker knew how things work around here," she said, but it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself than me. There was something desperate in how she clung to his name, like it was some kind of magic word that would make my legal documents disappear. The possessive way she said, "Walker left me certain understandings about community needs," made my skin crawl. There was something almost desperate in her voice, like she was clinging to some promise that maybe wasn't as solid as she wanted it to be. I found myself wondering what exactly Walker had told her and why she seemed so uncomfortable talking about a dead man's supposed promises. But before I could ask any follow-up questions, Laura shifted back to intimidation mode with the grace of someone switching from a customer service voice to a manager voice. "The HOA board will handle this properly," she announced with fake authority that fooled absolutely no one. "You'll learn the rules soon enough, Mr. Reed." The way she said my name made it sound like a threat. And as she walked back to her car, she kept glancing over her shoulder at my cabin like she expected someone to emerge from the shadows. I actually found myself looking over my shoulder, too, wondering what she thought she was going to see. Her eyes locked onto mine, and her voice dropped to a tone I hadn't heard before, one that cut through the air like a threat wrapped in a smile. "I think we need to talk about your property. I trust you'll be cooperative." The words hung in the air, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. Something told me this wasn't just a friendly chat. As her car disappeared down the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that Charles Walker's ghost was somehow still laughing at both of us. There was something about this whole interaction that felt choreographed, like I'd just played out the first scene of a play I didn't know I was in. I sat back down with my coffee, but the peaceful morning was completely ruined. Looking back now, I realized that feeling was absolutely right, and I was about to discover just how deep this rabbit hole really went. The next day, as I returned from groceries, I found the first violation notice. My red doormat, the one I'd bought specifically because it reminded me of autumn leaves and seemed cheerful and welcoming, was apparently a non-approved color. By day 3, $50 for a non-approved red doormat, $75 for grass half an inch too tall, $100 for noise-polluting wind chimes. All bogus. All targeted. I actually had to read the first one twice because I couldn't believe someone was seriously fining me for a doormat. I mean, come on. It's a doormat. People wipe their feet on it. Who cares what color it is? But that was just the opening shot in what I now realize was a carefully orchestrated campaign of harassment designed to break my spirit and my bank account. The grass had literally grown half an inch overnight, which suggested Laura was measuring it with a ruler like some kind of suburban law enforcement officer. The wind chimes were barely audible from my own deck, let alone disturbing neighbors. At first, I thought it was just a few harmless mistakes, some petty rules to get used to. But with every new fine, my patience thinned. I found myself staring at the notices for hours, wondering what I had done wrong, what I could have possibly done to deserve this. The absurdity of it all gnawed at me, my own property being marked as violations, and I felt a spark of something sharper than anger, defiance. I'm not even sure why I was surprised at this point, but the systematic nature of it was almost impressive in its pettiness. Laura was clearly operating on the principle that death by 1,000 paper cuts is just as effective as a sword, and she was determined to prove it. Instead of getting angry, which was clearly what Laura wanted, I decided to treat this like debugging bad software code. I created a spreadsheet, photographed everything, and timestamped all violations with GPS coordinates, like I was documenting evidence for a federal investigation. If she wanted a paper war, I'd document every shot fired and turn this into the most well-documented harassment case in HOA history. My engineering brain kicked into overdrive, and I started looking for patterns in her enforcement, like I was analyzing user behavior data. It didn't take long to realize that Laura had a very selective interpretation of the rules, and her targeting was definitely personal rather than systematic. That's when I decided to do some reconnaissance of my own. I spent a weekend walking through the neighborhood with my camera, documenting every single rule violation I could find, like some kind of suburban private investigator. Laura's own house was a goldmine of hypocrisy that would have made a corruption investigator weep with joy. She had an oversized political sign in her yard that clearly violated the sign ordinance, an unauthorized fence modification that didn't match the approved community standards, and her dog running loose daily without a leash in direct violation of the pet policy. I photographed everything systematically, building a case file that would make any lawyer proud. The irony was almost too perfect. I was organizing my evidence when I met Tim, my neighbor, who was nervously tending his garden, like he was afraid someone might catch him enjoying himself. He had that look of someone who had been living under a microscope for too long, constantly checking over his shoulder for violations and fines. Tim was probably in his 60s with the weathered hands of someone who had spent years working outside, but his movements were jittery and anxious in a way that suggested he'd been ground down by constant surveillance. He kept glancing around before speaking, and when he finally did talk, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Oliver, you seem like a good person. Charles Walker, your cabin's previous owner, he had problems with Laura too." The way Tim said Walker's name with this mixture of respect and something else I couldn't quite identify made me lean in closer. There was clearly more to this story than a simple property dispute. And Tim obviously knew something I didn't. His nervous energy suggested he was about to share something that could get him in trouble, but he was going to do it anyway because he genuinely wanted to help me understand what I was up against. Walker was a good man, Tim continued, his voice getting even quieter. But Laura made his last years miserable with constant harassment. She wanted his land even then, kept finding excuses to fine him and make his life difficult. Tim looked around one more time before continuing, his voice dropping even lower like we were discussing state secrets. Before Walker died, he kept saying Laura would regret her greed someday. He spent his final months planning something big, something he called his masterpiece. Tim whispered, Walker left Laura a surprise, his masterpiece. Only later, researching his past, did I understand. Walker didn't build cabins. He built traps for people like her. What exactly had Walker been planning, and how did my cabin fit into whatever scheme he'd been cooking up? Tim's expression suggested he knew more than he was saying. That evening, I spent hours researching Walker online, and what I found was fascinating in a slightly terrifying way. Newspaper articles described his reputation for exposing corruption through clever architectural tricks and elaborate practical jokes that always taught moral lessons to greedy clients. He was known for building hidden features into buildings that would embarrass dishonest people or expose their true intentions at exactly the right moment. One article described how he designed a city hall with a fountain that would malfunction whenever corrupt officials held press conferences, soaking them in front of cameras. His obituary mentioned that he spent his final years perfecting his masterwork. And suddenly Tim's comments started making a lot more sense. The next morning brought a certified letter demanding my appearance at a disciplinary hearing, delivered with all the drama of a court summons. Laura's signature was bold and confident across the bottom, but I noticed something odd about the letterhead. It showed Walker's old address crossed out and replaced with Laura's handwriting, like she'd appropriated something that wasn't quite hers yet. A symbol I hadn't noticed before. A strange marking that seemed oddly familiar. My heart skipped a beat as the truth began to dawn on me. Laura wasn't just enforcing rules. She was trying to take something from me. Staring at that altered letterhead, I realized Walker hadn't just sold me a cabin. He'd recruited me for something I didn't understand yet, and I was starting to suspect that Laura had no idea what she was really walking into. I spent hours poring over the HOA documents, but something didn't add up. Each page I turned, the more I felt like I was walking into a trap, a maze designed to keep me from the truth. What was it they didn't want me to see? The deeper I dug, the more things started to feel rigged. The hearing was set up in Laura's dining room, arranged like some kind of makeshift courtroom with her sitting at the head of the table like a judge presiding over her own personal tribunal. 3 board members were clearly her friends, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs when they saw me walk in with organized evidence folders and a professional-looking briefcase that screamed, "I'm not messing around." I could tell this was supposed to be easy intimidation, the kind of meeting where the homeowner gets overwhelmed and just agrees to pay whatever fine they're demanding to make the nightmare stop. But I'd spent years dealing with hostile clients and patent lawyers who could eat HOA board members for breakfast. So, a suburban tribunal wasn't exactly going to shake me. Still, the whole setup felt like a kangaroo court designed to railroad me into submission. My first power move was pulling out my digital recorder and stating clearly, I'll be recording this meeting as allowed under HOA Rules Section 4.7. The silence that followed was delicious. Laura tried to object, sputtering something about privacy and procedure, but I quoted the exact rule number and the specific language about homeowner rights during disciplinary proceedings. Suddenly, the board members realized their words were going to have consequences beyond this room, and the whole dynamic shifted like someone had just turned on the lights. Laura's confident smile faltered just a bit, and I could see her mentally recalculating her approach. Looking back, I should have known right then that she was going to double down instead of backing off. Bullies usually do when their authority gets challenged publicly. I methodically presented my property deed, survey maps, and title insurance documents, laying them out like evidence in a court case, while explaining each document's legal significance. The board barely glanced at my ironclad legal proof before dismissing it entirely, which was honestly impressive in its shamelessness. Then I pulled out my photos of Laura's own rule violations, complete with dates, times, and GPS coordinates that would have impressed a forensic investigator. The board members looked genuinely surprised at her hypocrisy, exchanging glances that suggested they were learning about their president's selective enforcement for the first time. One member actually picked up a photo of Laura's oversized political sign and stared at it like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. But despite overwhelming evidence in my favor, the board voted against me unanimously after what appeared to be meaningful eye contact from Laura. She announced a fine of $1,500 plus daily penalties of $100 until I complied with her demands, delivered with the smugness of someone who thought they had just checkmated me. That's when Laura crossed the line from harassment into something much more serious. And I realized this wasn't just about doormat colors or grass height anymore. Mr. Reed has 30 days to pay or will place a lien on his property, she announced with this triumphant smile that made my blood boil. The words hung in the air like a threat, and I could see the other board members shifting uncomfortably as they realized what she just said. This was a direct attack on my ownership rights, and she was essentially trying to steal my property through legal intimidation disguised as HOA enforcement. A lien on my property for a doormat violation. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also exactly the kind of overreach that would destroy her in court. One of the board members shifted nervously and said, "Laura, maybe we should reconsider the lien threat. That seems excessive for a doormat violation." His voice carried the tone of someone who was finally realizing they were part of something that had gone way too far. He was probably imagining explaining this to his wife, or to his neighbors, or to a judge who would laugh them out of court. But Laura cut him off sharply with, "The decision is final," though I noticed the crack in her unanimous support. Two other board members were exchanging worried glances that suggested they were having second thoughts about this whole charade. And one actually took notes when Laura made the lien threat, probably to cover himself legally. Ice-cold determination flooded through me as I realized Laura had just made the biggest mistake of her life by escalating this from harassment to theft. My engineer problem-solving mode kicked into full gear, and I stood up deliberately, maintaining steady eye contact with each board member, like I was memorizing their faces for future reference. "I'll be in touch with my attorney," I said calmly, my voice carrying the weight of someone who actually knew how to fight back through the legal system. "This recording will be very helpful evidence in the lawsuit that's coming." The words hung in the air like a threat, but it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. For just a moment, Laura's confident facade cracked completely. A flash of genuine fear crossed her features as she realized I wasn't going to cave, pay quietly, and disappear like her previous victims. Instead, she just created documented evidence of abuse of power with multiple witnesses who were now looking very uncomfortable about their participation. Just as I thought I had all the answers, I received a call from a neighbor. They told me that Laura had been visiting properties, marking them for assessment. But one name stood out in their list, mine. She was already planning her next move, and I knew I had no time to waste. Clara Stone came highly recommended for fighting corrupt HOAs, and I could see why the moment I walked into her office. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who immediately zeroed in on the real issue. While most lawyers would have been focused on the surface drama and billable hours, her office walls were covered with framed victory letters from grateful clients and news articles about HOA corruption fights she'd won, which gave me hope that I wasn't the first person to face this kind of systematic harassment. "Most people just pay the fines and give up," she said, flipping through my documentation with obvious approval. "But you've got something here. This isn't random harassment. There's a pattern, and patterns usually mean money. Let's dig deeper and find out what Laura really wants." I wish I could tell you I felt confident about taking on the HA legal system, but honestly, I was terrified of what we might find and how much this fight was going to cost me. I searched through the property records like a man digging for gold. The more I found, the more the pieces of the puzzle snapped into place. But what I uncovered sent a shockwave through me. Laura had been orchestrating this from the beginning, and the land wasn't just a prize for her. It was a pawn in a much larger game. I spent 3 days at the county office researching permit applications, wading through a bureaucratic maze of filing systems that seemed designed to discourage casual investigation by anyone who wasn't getting paid by the hour. The clerks were helpful once they realized I wasn't going away. And persistence pays off when you're dealing with public records that can't legally be hidden from taxpayers. I finally found what I was looking for, buried in construction permits from the past year, filed under a name that made my blood run cold. Kent Brothers Construction LLC had submitted multiple applications for a boutique lakeside resort project. The plans looked expensive and professional, the kind of development that would bring in millions of dollars if it could get approved. But every single application had been rejected for the same reason: insufficient vehicle access to proposed development site. That's when I noticed the attached site map showing the proposed access road running directly through my waterfront property like a highway to hell. The conspiracy suddenly became crystal clear, and I actually had to sit down for a minute to process what I was looking at because the implications were staggering. Laura didn't want my land for community benefit or HOA power trips or any of the noble reasons she'd been spouting. Her brother's construction company needed my property to make their $1 million resort project viable, and she was willing to destroy my life to get it. This whole harassment campaign wasn't about rules or authority or community standards or protecting property values. It was about family business greed, plain and simple, wrapped up in the language of civic responsibility to make it sound legitimate. She was trying to force me off my land through systematic harassment and illegal fines so her family could profit from a development that required my waterfront access to succeed. The resort plans were elaborate, showing luxury cabins, a marina, and a restaurant that would generate massive revenue if they could just get access to the lake through my property. I'm not even sure why I was shocked at this point, but the calculated nature of it was breathtaking. Laura had looked me in the eye and lied about community property while planning to steal my land for her family's financial gain, using her HOA authority as a weapon against me. The level of corruption was almost impressive in its brazenness, like she'd studied every dirty trick in the book and decided to use them all at once. That's when Clara made another crucial discovery while searching environmental protection records. And this is where things got really interesting. Walker had filed a conservation easement on my waterfront area 8 years ago, permanently restricting any development on that land. Any attempt to build an access road through my property would trigger federal environmental violations with fines up to $10,000 per day. Oliver, this easement is bulletproof, Clara said, studying the document carefully with the expression of someone who just found buried treasure. But why would Walker restrict his own valuable land so severely? What was he protecting it from? The answer was starting to become obvious, and it was brilliant. Walker had known someone would eventually try to exploit his land, and he made it legally impossible while making it look completely available to greedy eyes. Digging deeper into Walker's background revealed a pattern of elaborate schemes against greedy clients and corrupt officials that read like a masterclass in psychological warfare. Newspaper articles described fake architectural plans that exposed corruption, hidden legal clauses that protected honest people from predatory schemes, and always poetic justice rather than simple revenge. One article described how he designed a city hall with a fountain that would malfunction whenever corrupt officials held press conferences, soaking them in front of cameras. His obituary mentioned that he spent his final years perfecting his masterwork. And suddenly Tim's comments started making a lot more sense. Clara leaned back in her chair with something approaching admiration in her voice. Oliver, I think Charles Walker anticipated everything Laura would do. This conservation easement isn't just protection, it's bait. He knew someone like Laura would eventually try to exploit his land, and he set up the perfect trap. She spread out the legal documents like puzzle pieces, showing me how they all connected. Let Laura make the next move. She's walking into a situation she doesn't see coming, and when she crosses that line, the consequences are going to be automatic and devastating. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was holding the winning hand. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was playing a game whose rules I still didn't completely understand. I thought I had her cornered until I found Walker's final letter. And the truth was darker than I imagined. My security camera caught Laura meeting with contractors on my property while I was away getting groceries, and watching the footage later was like watching someone commit a crime in slow motion while narrating their own arrest. She was pointing exactly where the access road should go, gesturing confidently while the contractors took measurements and looked increasingly uncomfortable with what she was asking them to do. The audio picked up her saying, "Just get it started. We'll handle the legal issues later," which was exactly the kind of evidence Clara had told me to hope for. Laura was so confident in her illegal plan that she wasn't even trying to hide what she was doing. She was committing federal environmental crimes on camera while apparently believing her HOA authority somehow trumped conservation law. The arrogance was breathtaking, but also exactly what Walker had predicted would happen. I returned from the store to find contractors actually installing fence posts directly on my protected waterfront land, with Laura directing the work and growing visibly frustrated with their slow progress. It was like watching someone walk into a trap in broad daylight while complaining that the trap wasn't comfortable enough. I had to admire Walker's psychological insight into how greed makes people blind to obvious dangers. The contractors kept asking about permits and environmental clearances, clearly sensing they were being asked to do something questionable. But Laura kept brushing off their concerns with increasingly desperate authority. "I'm the HOA president. I'm handling the paperwork," she kept saying, but even I could see the workers weren't buying it. One contractor actually stopped working and said, "Ma'am, we need to see environmental permits before we continue on waterfront property." Laura's response was to threaten to find different contractors, which just made them more suspicious. I executed Clara's carefully planned response strategy with military precision, and it was beautiful to watch unfold. One phone call triggered a chain reaction of official intervention that Laura never saw coming. Clara contacted the building inspector, who called the county surveyor, while I reported property destruction to the sheriff's office. The timing was synchronized perfectly, and within an hour my property was crawling with officials who all arrived at roughly the same time, like some kind of bureaucratic SWAT team. Neighbors started appearing from their houses, sensing drama and gathering to watch Laura's scheme collapse in real time. Tim nodded knowingly from the crowd and whispered, "Told you Walker left surprises." The look on Laura's face when she realized what was happening was priceless. Pure panic mixed with the dawning realization that she'd walked into something much bigger than she'd anticipated. Clara arrived first, sharp business suit and confidence radiating authority as she approached Laura directly like a prosecutor approaching a defendant. "Mrs. Kent, you're destroying protected environmental land in violation of federal conservation law," she announced loud enough for everyone to hear, her voice carrying the weight of someone who delivered the speech before. The building inspector began examining the fence posts, while the county surveyor confirmed property boundaries with GPS equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything Laura had expected to deal with. The sheriff's deputy started documenting property destruction and trespass violations, taking photos and measurements like he was processing a crime scene. For the first time since I'd met her, Laura looked genuinely terrified as she realized the magnitude of what she'd walked into. This wasn't some suburban HOA dispute anymore. This was federal law enforcement territory, and she was completely out of her depth. Federal environmental violations carry automatic fines up to $10,000 per day, and the contractors immediately stopped work when they heard that number. They literally dropped their tools and refused to continue without proper permits they knew didn't exist, backing away from the fence posts like they were radioactive. Laura tried maintaining her authority, but her voice was shaking as she realized her confident illegal plan was crumbling in front of half the neighborhood. "I'm the HOA president," she kept shouting, like it was some kind of magic incantation that would make federal law disappear. The sheriff issued her a trespass citation. The building inspector ordered immediate work stoppage, and the surveyor confirmed the fence posts were illegally placed on protected land. The contractors demanded immediate payment for their wasted time and refused to remove the fence posts without additional compensation, leaving Laura to pay double for her failed scheme. Public humiliation was the final ingredient in Walker's perfect recipe for justice, and it was everything I could have hoped for. A crowd of neighbors who'd been intimidated by Laura for years watched her authority completely collapse in real time, like watching the Wizard of Oz revealed as just another person behind a curtain. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had been terrorized by Laura's arbitrary fines, whispered to others in the crowd, "First time I've seen someone stand up to her successfully." Laura was forced to pay the contractors for removing the fence posts at her own expense. And as she walked away from her very public defeat, she turned back with pure hatred burning in her features. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. Read," she said, her voice raw with desperation and rage. But I was starting to understand exactly what I was interfering with, and it was beautiful. Clara helped me craft a detailed letter exposing Laura's illegal land grab scheme, complete with photos of property destruction, copies of conservation documents, and a timeline of her harassment campaign that read like a prosecution memo. We included evidence packets showing Laura's own rule violations and her family's financial interest in stealing my land, laying out the corruption in terms so clear that even the most trusting neighbor couldn't ignore it. I spent the night combing through every piece of evidence, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Each document I examined felt like a weight added to my shoulders, a reminder that my peaceful retreat had become a battleground. My hands shook as I tried to make sense of it all, knowing that once I sent this out, there would be no turning back. The letter went to every household in the community, and I have to admit, I felt a little like a revolutionary distributing propaganda leaflets. But sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. And Laura had been using community intimidation for years to maintain her power. It was time to show everyone exactly what kind of person they'd elected to lead their HOA and what she was willing to do to line her family's pockets. As I dug further, I found evidence of Laura's ties to a powerful group within the community, people who had a vested interest in my land. It wasn't just her. This was a web of deceit, and every thread led back to something bigger than I could have imagined. The community explosion was immediate and overwhelming, like opening a dam that had been holding back years of frustration. Calls started pouring in within hours of mail delivery, with neighbors expressing outrage and sharing their own Laura horror stories for the first time. Mrs. Patterson had been fined $200 for having the wrong mailbox color, apparently because her cheerful yellow didn't meet community standards. Mr. Rodriguez was forced to remove his children's playground because it was architecturally inconsistent, even though it was in his backyard where no one could see it. The pattern of abuse became clear once people started talking openly instead of suffering in silence.
More calls came throughout the evening as word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, with each conversation revealing new layers of Laura's systematic abuse. Laura had terrorized the community for years through selective rule enforcement, arbitrary fines, and personal vendettas against anyone who questioned her authority or failed to show proper deference to her self-appointed royal status. People were sharing stories I couldn't believe, like elderly residents being fined for bird feeders because they attracted undesirable wildlife, and young families being harassed for children's toys left in their own yards because they created visual pollution. One neighbor told me Laura had actually threatened to put a lien on their house because their garden gnome wasn't approved by the architectural committee. Another family had been forced to repaint their house 3 times because Laura kept rejecting the colors as not compatible with community standards, even though the colors were clearly listed as approved in the HOA guidelines. A retired teacher shared that Laura had fined her for having too many books visible through her front window, claiming they created visual clutter that violated aesthetic standards. The systematic nature of her abuse was breathtaking, targeting the elderly, families with children, and anyone who seemed vulnerable or unable to fight back effectively. I started understanding why Walker had spent so much time and effort setting up his elaborate trap. He'd known exactly what kind of tyrant would eventually try to exploit his land. The community self-organized an emergency meeting within 48 hours, and Laura tried maintaining control of the agenda, but residents took over the moment she started speaking. For the first time in years, people saw that Laura's power wasn't absolute, and they weren't afraid to challenge her directly. The community center was packed with angry residents who had finally found their voice. And Laura's attempts at maintaining order were drowned out by questions about the illegal land grab and demands for accountability. Someone had printed copies of my evidence packet and distributed them throughout the room, so everyone could see the photos of Laura's own rule violations and the construction permits showing her family's scheme. The dramatic public confrontation was everything Walker could have hoped for, a complete dismantling of Laura's authority in front of the entire community.
Laura attempted opening remarks about maintaining community standards, but the crowd interrupted with pointed questions about conservation law violations and family business conflicts of interest. Clara presented a detailed timeline of Laura's crimes, while residents shared their experiences with her abuse of power. Each story added to the mountain of evidence against her. 2 board members publicly distanced themselves from Laura's actions, saying, "We weren't aware of the conservation easement or the family business connection. This changes everything." Laura's support was crumbling in real time. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly resident who'd been terrorized by Laura for years, rose shakily from her chair and delivered the killing blow with the quiet dignity of someone who'd finally had enough. I motioned to remove Laura Kent as HOA president for abuse of power and illegal actions against community members. The second came immediately from multiple voices throughout the room, creating a chorus of support that must have sounded like thunder to Laura's ears. The vote was devastating, 23-1, with only Laura voting for herself. She was stripped of official power, facing potential criminal charges, and her reputation destroyed throughout the community in a single evening. But instead of accepting defeat gracefully, Laura became more frantic and desperate, like a cornered animal lashing out at everything around her. "You people don't understand what you're destroying," she shouted. "Charles Walker promised me access to that waterfront area. It's rightfully mine." Her outburst revealed the crucial information Tim and I had been waiting for. Walker had indeed promised her something about my land, and her obsession was about to lead her into the final trap he'd prepared years ago. Laura called one last meeting, screaming about Walker's promise. What she revealed next proved she still didn't get it. Laura cornered me after the community meeting with wild eyes and a desperate whisper that made my blood run cold. "You think you've won, but Walker's last laugh isn't what you think it is. There's something about your precious cabin you don't know." Her smile was unhinged, clinging to some final hope that she could still turn this situation around. I honestly wasn't sure if she was bluffing or if Walker had left one more surprise I hadn't discovered yet, but the way she said it with such desperate confidence made me wonder what final card she thought she was holding. Her voice carried the manic energy of someone who'd lost everything but still believed they had one last ace up her sleeve. Laura called one last emergency community meeting, her final attempt to rally support and somehow prove that Walker had promised her my waterfront land. She arrived looking haggard and defeated, like someone who'd been fighting a losing battle for months and was running on desperation and caffeine. Her usual perfect appearance was gone, replaced by someone who clearly hadn't been sleeping well. But she was still clinging to this obsession that had destroyed her life and reputation, like someone clutching a life preserver that was actually an anchor dragging her down. As I walked into the community center, my heart pounded in my chest. Every face turned toward me, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The community center was packed again, but this time the mood was different. People weren't there to support Laura. They were there to witness what everyone knew would be her final stand before complete defeat. Charles Walker specifically told me that waterfront area would become community property after his death, she announced to the packed room, her voice carrying a manic edge that made everyone uncomfortable. "Oliver Reed is stealing from all of us. He's destroying our community's future for his own selfish gain." Her voice was breaking with desperation, trying to manipulate community sentiment one last time. But everyone could see she was grasping at straws. The community had already seen her corruption exposed in vivid detail. I stepped forward slowly, feeling the weight of this climactic moment and the entire community's attention focused on me. Something about Laura's earlier whisper bothered me, but I pushed forward with the revelation I'd been building toward. I knew I had to control the room. "Laura, I have one simple question for you. Did you ever wonder why Charles Walker placed such a restrictive conservation easement on my land 8 years ago? Laura's face showed confusion, then growing horror as the implications began dawning on her like sunrise revealing a battlefield. That wasn't a trap, was it? A trap for greedy people like you. Laura's face, already pale, drained of all color. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, a friendly face, anything to contradict the terrible truth that was unfolding before her. But there was nothing, only the silent, accusing stares of the community she had terrorized and the cold, unwavering gaze of the man who had just exposed her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The realization hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and her voice. She had been so consumed by her own greed, so certain of her own cleverness, that she had walked blindly into a snare laid years ago by a man she thought she had outsmarted. The conservation easement, the very thing she had dismissed as an inconvenience, was the key to her undoing. It wasn't just a legal document, it was a testament to Walker's foresight, a monument to his genius. And she, Laura Kent, the self-proclaimed Queen of Willow Lake, was about to become its final, most spectacular victim. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She was trapped, and she knew it. Every lie, every manipulation, every petty cruelty she had inflicted on this community was now coming back to haunt her, magnified 1,000-fold. The weight of her actions, once so easily dismissed, now pressed down on her, suffocating her with its enormity. She was no longer the powerful HOA president, the intimidating force of nature. She was just a woman, exposed and vulnerable, stripped bare of her authority and her dignity. And the community, once so cowed by her presence, now watched her with a mixture of pity and grim satisfaction. The tables had turned, and she was utterly, irrevocably defeated. The air crackled with anticipation, everyone waiting for the final shoe to drop. And it did. With a quiet, almost gentle voice, I delivered the coup de grace. Charles Walker didn't promise you access to the waterfront, Laura. He promised you a front-row seat to your own destruction. The words hung in the air, a chilling echo of her own hubris. And then, the dam broke. The murmurs turned into a roar, a collective gasp of understanding and outrage. Laura stumbled backward, her face a mask of horror, as the full weight of Walker's final masterpiece crashed down upon her. She had been so focused on the prize, so blinded by her own avarice, that she had failed to see the intricate web of justice being woven around her. And now she was ensnared, irrevocably. The community, once divided and fearful, now stood united in their condemnation of her. The years of silent suffering, of petty fines and arbitrary rules, had finally found their voice, and it was a thunderous chorus of defiance. Laura, once the architect of their misery, was now the object of their scorn. Her reign of terror was over, and the era of justice had begun. The irony was almost too perfect. She had sought to claim what was not hers, and in doing so, she had lost everything. The waterfront, the very symbol of her greed, had become her undoing. And Walker, even in death, had ensured that true justice would prevail. The story of Willow Lake would forever be etched with the tale of Laura Kent, the HOA president who dared to challenge a dead man's legacy and lost. And I, the unwitting pawn in Walker's grand design, had become the instrument of her downfall. The lake, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, now shimmered with the quiet triumph of a battle won, a testament to the enduring power of truth and justice. The final chapter of Charles Walker's masterpiece was complete, and it was a masterpiece indeed. The community meeting dissolved into a cacophony of voices, some cheering, some expressing their long-held grievances, all united in their relief. Laura, utterly broken, was escorted out by a few of the more sympathetic residents, her head bowed in shame. Her reign was over. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The HOA board was completely restructured, with Tim, my neighbor, elected as the new president. He immediately began reviewing all past fines, promising to reverse any that were found to be unjust. The conservation easement on my property was officially recognized and celebrated as a vital part of the community's natural heritage. The Kent Brothers Construction LLC's resort project was permanently blocked, and their reputation was in tatters. Laura herself faced legal repercussions for her actions, including charges of harassment and attempted fraud. The lawsuit I had threatened was no longer necessary, as the community itself had delivered justice. The lakefront property, once a source of contention, became a symbol of unity and a reminder of the power of a community united against corruption. I finally got to enjoy my coffee on the dock, the silence no longer broken by the sound of Laura's heels, but by the gentle lapping of the waves. The red doormat remained, a small but significant trophy of a battle won, and the wind chimes, once a source of finds, now sang a sweet song of freedom. Charles Walker, wherever he was surely smiling. His masterpiece was complete, and it was more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. The story of Willow Lake became a legend, whispered among new residents as a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of a community. I, Oliver Reed, had found more than just a lakeside cabin. I had found a home, a purpose, and a community worth fighting for. The quiet life I had sought had turned into an unexpected adventure, but one that had ultimately brought a profound sense of peace and belonging. The lake, once a dream, was now a reality, and it was more perfect than I had ever dared to imagine. The end. After Laura's humiliating exit, the community meeting continued, but the atmosphere had completely transformed. The tension that had hung heavy in the air for years, a product of Laura's oppressive rule, had finally dissipated. It was replaced by a palpable sense of relief, a collective sigh of freedom. People who had once been hesitant to speak now shared their stories openly, their voices filled with a newfound courage. The room buzzed with discussions about how to move forward, how to rebuild trust, and how to ensure that such an abuse of power would never happen again. Tim, with his quiet wisdom and steady demeanor, emerged as a natural leader. He listened patiently to everyone, his calm presence a stark contrast to Laura's volatile outbursts. He proposed a series of changes to the HOA bylaws, focusing on transparency, accountability, and community involvement. The residents, eager for a fresh start, embraced his proposals with enthusiasm. The old board members, who had either been complicit or too intimidated to act, quietly resigned, paving the way for a new era of leadership. The community was finally taking back control of its destiny. The days that followed were a testament to the power of collective action. The fines Laura had levied were systematically reviewed, and many were overturned. Mrs. Patterson received a heartfelt apology and a refund for her mailbox fine, which she promptly donated to a fund for community improvements. Mr. Rodriguez's children's playground was not only reapproved, but became a symbol of the new, more inclusive Willow Lake. The community organized a community cleanup day, where neighbors worked side by side, not just to tidy up the common areas, but to metaphorically sweep away the remnants of Laura's tyranny. The air was filled with laughter and camaraderie, a stark contrast to the fear and suspicion that had once permeated the neighborhood. Children played freely, their joyful shouts echoing across the lake, a sound that had been stifled under Laura's strict rules. Even the local newspaper ran a story about Willow Lake's transformation, highlighting the community's resilience and newfound unity. It was a powerful narrative of redemption, a testament to the idea that even in the face of adversity, a community can rise stronger and more vibrant than before. The lake, once a battleground, was now a sanctuary, a place where people could truly feel at home. And I, Oliver Reed, found myself not just a resident, but an integral part of this thriving community, a silent guardian of Walker's legacy. The red doormat, the wind chimes, and the perfectly manicured lawn were no longer symbols of defiance, but emblems of a peaceful victory, a quiet triumph over tyranny. The echoes of Laura's threats had faded, replaced by the harmonious symphony of a community reborn. And as the sun set over Willow Lake, casting a golden glow upon the water, I knew that Charles Walker, wherever he was indeed smiling. His masterpiece was complete, and its true beauty lay not just in the protection of the land, but in the liberation of a community.